Yeah.
Money never sleeps, pal.
Money, money, must be funny in the richest girl. Oh, the richest girl, if I get a little money.
Il faut bien admettre en effet que quelques petits excès ont été commis.
D'ailleurs, à propos de marge, je trouve un peu baroque de vous prêter à 8% du pognon que vous faites travailler à 20.
Ils avaient le droit de faire ça?
Pourquoi? Le droit.
Avec moi, vous êtes sûr de revoir votre argent.
I want you to deal with your problems by becoming rich.
Je crois qu'il serait temps, messieurs, de tenir le langage du bon sens.
Well, thank you, Emmanuel, for inviting us. So I thought to begin with a kind of a very short presentation of why I think Common Stack is an important project related to the commons, and why I believe that it's something that we should follow and listen to. So I just want to, very broad framing. So what I think the first thing in the background is, of course, the invention of Bitcoin, which is critiqued from the left for many reasons, and I think some of the critiques are really valid. But I think the remaining importance of Bitcoin was to create the first socially sovereign currency. And I think this is very important. So in other words, a currency that does not depend on the recognition by the state, but actually depends on the trust of a community, in this case in the algorithm, but it's the trust of the community that creates the value. And I think despite all its flaws, it has the advantage of being the first one. So it created this new reality of a globally scalable virtual currency. And it remains not just a reserve currency in terms of value, but especially also a tool for activists, when they're faced with like governmental measures, like, Assange was, his whole financial support was cut out. Same thing happened recently with the Canadian truckers. So when the government intervenes in the free flow of financial exchange, then it's really good to have this kind of alternative that is there. Okay, then the blockchain, which for me means kind of a transition from the internet of communication to an internet of transactions. I think this is also very important. So what it creates, in my view, is the capacity of creating a global ledger, a global accounting system that creates the capacity to organize production into ecosystems. And through these ecosystems, so open supply chains and open accounting, we can start integrating externalities that we are not currently integrating in the system that we have. So I see the blockchain, but probably more specifically post-blockchain infrastructures eventually, that don't have a number of the disadvantages that we now have, as the kind of global cyber physical infrastructure that will allow us to reorganize the global economy. And anyway, so that's the second point. So within that framing, I think we have to realize that a lot of blockchain, Bitcoin, crypto developments are inspired by technocratic and libertarian values. And so these are people who believe that the economy consists of individuals that make free choices and that can be incentivized in their choice making. But I think what is missing is a recognition of the commons and of more collective and socialized values, right? And I'm not saying it should be completely different or completely individual. I think the ideal will be hybrid and mixed system that take the best of both. So in that context, that as an alternative to the mostly libertarian ledger projects that are completely free market oriented, I think we have in Common Stack one of the best instances of a project that starts experimenting with commons-oriented principles rather than purely libertarian principles. So I think that's enough for me to say. That's why I like Common Stack, because what they're doing, they're merging and converging the ledger space with the rules of the commons as developed by Elinor Ostrom and her work on physical commons. And so we need an upgrade for the new digital commons, and I think Common Stack is one of the players that is doing that, that is trying to develop a new type of rules and incentives that are more cognizant of what we need if you want commons institutions rather than only market or state institutions. And so now I'm asking Jeff, maybe first to present yourself, so to say what is your place in this Common Stack project. And if you want to give some details on your personal background, that is fine. And then maybe maybe present your way what Common Stack is. And I'm especially then also interested in the status of the project today, like where did you want to be and where are you, and maybe the next steps. And then we can continue from that and maybe have more dialogue and questions after that. So if you can take, 10-15 minutes to, can be shorter or longer, it's up to you, but just to present what the project is about.
Sure, absolutely. So a bit about myself. My name is Jeff Emmet. My background is in electrical engineering. I studied at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And then after that, I kind of traveled the world for about 10 years. Actually spent a bunch of time in Thailand. I'm surprised we didn't cross paths there earlier, Michel, but it was great to catch up with you when we did. And found my way back to engineering through the blockchain. I fell down the rabbit hole of the nascent discipline of token engineering, which was currently bringing sort of all of the techniques and the processes that we use for international power grids, fault sensitivity testing, failure analysis, the same kind of technologies that built the internet, where what we're doing with blockchains is essentially, large scale economic power grids. So a lot of the same technologies can be applied. It's just such a new space of design that they haven't really been ported over yet. A lot of the development in Web3 starts with, a dev team with some ideas, they write a white paper and they start coding. And a lot of these sort of engineering design process, modeling, simulation, testing didn't really exist and still is very new in the space. So the Common Stack kind of entered through that, rigorous engineering design. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned the libertarian. I feel like the Common Stack is sort of a bridge between the libertarian and the communist applications of this technology, because it's not just about the individual, but it's also not just about the collective. And I think this is kind of what we need to balance moving forward is, aligning the incentives of what's best for each of us and the collective, of course, staying within, planetary ecological limits. I think Kate Raworth's, donut economics model is really fantastic for this. And I think, what you mentioned earlier is embedding the externalities within these systems is really, we can do this with greater granularity and subsidiarity than ever before. We aren't talking about imposing limits. We are talking about co-creating our own limits within these cyber-physical, although still mostly digital commons, at least, in the state of the technology so far. So let me back up a little bit and explain sort of what the Common Stack is from a high level. The Common Stack is ultimately a design pattern. We're not looking to create, an operating system. We aren't looking to create, it's a toolkit. Each commons is highly contextual. There's no one answer for how to create a commons. So ultimately what we're trying to do, we've started with these 4 components that we've been working on and iterating on in a couple of research and experimentation efforts. And essentially they are to collect a bunch of funds, have those funds available to everyone within the commons. So essentially the membership is through holding tokens. Ostrom's principle number 1, you have a boundaries on the commons, who's in, who's out, who can access the resources, who can't. And that's basically managed through token ownership. And I mean, there's a lot to be said about that. How are the tokens, earned? Today, most tokens are bought. So these systems are very plutocratic, at least in the early days, because blockchains don't have strong self-sovereign identification. So like you said, with Bitcoin and blockchain technologies in general, they're still very early. And because they're early, they don't have a lot of the necessary tools to make them ultimately useful for what we are looking to do. So I think we have to keep in mind the context of, where this technology is at. The internet was started development in the 50s. It didn't have user-facing applications until, the 80s, 90s. So there was a good 30, 40 years there where the technology, anyone outside of, the super geeks working on it would have seen it and said, oh, this is almost incomprehensible and definitely unusable. Like, what value am I ever going to get out of this? And yet today we all have, the internet of everything in our pocket. So I think, the span of evolution of that technology, keeping in context that Bitcoin was only created in 2008, your post and your one of the first tweets about it, the post on the P2P forum, I just think we are still so early in this experiment.
Right.
And of course, there's interest in taking this technology in all different ways. There's, hypercapitalism 2.0 is being built on it as well. So there's understandably a lot of critiques, particularly from the left, about this technology, the energy consumption, everything else. But a lot of that is being mitigated by new, successive waves of the technology, whether it's proof of stake, cutting down on the environmental costs by orders of magnitude, and also toolkits like the Common Stack coming together to sort of build more communist-oriented applications of the technology. And I think drawing inspiration from
I just want to mention that when you say communist, it sounds like communist, but you're probably saying communist, right, with two O's.
Communist, yeah.
Yeah, just to make sure that people understand what you're saying, because
absolutely,
communist has a lot of side meanings that may induce people in a wrong interpretation of what you're saying. So when Jeff says it's communist, it's like related to the commons. I just want to specify to make sure people get it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Important distinction. And I mean, I'm, reading Graeber and understanding that, the connotations of some of these terms have gotten far away from, their original intention. I'm definitely not talking about, state imposed anything. This is ultimately about communities coming together and creating their rules and creating their currencies and creating their CPRs. Ultimately what these are common pool resources that are kind of from the ground up. They can be collectively funded. This is one of the tools of the Common Stack. Actually, it's called the augmented bonding curve. Although I prefer to call it a commons market maker. It's like creating a market that benefits the commons. So you can put your money in. These CPRs are crowdfunded. It's like a pool of money on the internet. You put funds in, you get tokens back. Those tokens are your membership in this community. And of course, that could be a subscription to the community. It could be maybe a donation. It could be crowdfunding. However you want to, each community can kind of set their own rules around it. But ultimately, it's pooling our funds and then spending them on things that are of collective benefit. So those tokens that you got are also votes for how those tokens can be spent. And there's one of the other tools the Common Stack is working on is called conviction voting. So it kind of moves away from this, we vote on one thing every 4 years and that person then decides on all of the other decisions. We want to kind of push that decision-making down to the community itself and say, hey, why don't we imagine a voting tool where all of the proposals are on the table at any one time, and you can just express your preference towards, I think we should fill the potholes on my neighborhood street, or you think we should feed the homeless in our community. Everyone who holds tokens can express their preference towards which way we want to spend our funds, and over time, the conviction of your voice grows. So it's not just a one-time vote. Anyone can vote at any time. and the conviction of your choice grows over time. And ultimately what conviction voting does is it creates an aggregated sentiment. So it's kind of turning this into a signal processing problem. If we can get a better feel for how citizens want to spend, their tax money, for example, this could be a great signal for governments or NGOs or meta DAOs, even if there were like DAOs of DAOs, how those funds are spent.
Can we maybe spend a bit time on those two things and make sure that people understand it?
Sure.
So I want to start with augmented bonding curves. I had a hard time understanding it myself. So I will try to tell you what I understand it is, and then you can correct me. So what I understood an augmented bonding curve to be was some kind of technology or algorithm that protects the value of a pool of money. So to make sure that speculators don't pump and dump, as they say, like they buy a lot of tokens and then they suddenly sell them, or so they manipulate the value. And especially when you have small pools of money, you are very vulnerable to that. And so you develop some kind of algorithm that protects this pool of money from those kinds of manipulations. Is that a correct interpretation, or?
Yes, definitely. So the augmented bonding curve is a suite of smart contracts. So a smart contract is sort of a self-executing contract that can live on the internet. And this is the beauty of Ethereum. So going beyond Bitcoin, which is, self-sovereign money, Ethereum is sort of self-sovereign contracts. So we can create these smart contracts that essentially users can interact with, and they can also hold pools of money. So a smart contract can have a wallet, for example. So the smart contract,
it's a simple thing like saying, if I do X and you agree Y, then Z happens, right? Like
exactly.
The most basic.
Exactly. Yeah. So the augmented bonding curve works if I put in, let's say, USDC or DAI, which are basically like dollar stable coins. You put that in the reserve of the smart contract. So the smart contract holds on to those assets as a reserve currency, and then
like
issues you
or something, right?
Exactly.
Like some kind of collateral or.
Yeah. And then it issues you the token, which you can use to vote from the same smart contract. So it's basically like a mutual credit accounting type system. Assets go in, tokens come out. And then everyone can use those tokens to vote on whatever we think is, whatever is our collective value of the community. Maybe we are a tree planting community. So we want to make sure that the funds that are coming into this community are being used to plant trees. Right. But you could have any purpose-driven community using these tools, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. So the second thing you mentioned was what you call it, about the voting. Was it quadratic voting that
conviction voting?
Conviction voting. Okay. Is that different from quadratic voting, or is it the same?
It is different, but it's also composable. This is the interesting thing about these tools, is they can be combined in different ways. So you could actually have quadratic conviction voting. Combining that in an augmented bonding curve. So I guess we're touching on a lot of topics here. Quadratic voting is an interesting experiment from the radical exchange movement. They basically say that, intensity of preference is really important in voting. Right now, our voting systems are basically 1 or 0, right? And if you think about this from a signal processing point of view, that's not a very rich signal. I'm either for it or I'm against it. What we can do with quadratic voting is you can be, slightly for something, very much for something, or not at all for something. And that you turn what used to be a binary into a spectrum. You can now get an idea of how much the populace wants something, rather than just that they want it or that they don't, because that's not a very, very rich signal.
Well, I know that in some American elections recently, they tried out this kind of preference voting, right? Where you could, is that kind of similar, or is that something entirely different?
I'm not sure. Are you speaking of the example of the Colorado quadratic voting experiment, or like ranked choice voting?
Yeah, exactly. Ranked choice. That's the word I was looking for. Yeah. Is that kind of similar, or like this?
So actually, you could also have quadratic ranked choice, believe it or not. So this is the great thing about these tools is that they can be composed in a bunch of different ways. So there are actually within the common stack and the token engineering commons, we use kind of an internal tool. It's called token log. But how we make a lot of our decisions about what do we want to do? Here's option 1, option 2, option 3, option 4. We use that internally as a quadratic ranked choice voting tool. So in other words, Sorry, go ahead. Did you have another question?
I want to make some kind of hypothesis, and you can tell me if you agree with this or not. So sure. I'm quite skeptical about some of these systems being applied like in physical settings, because there's so many political and power issues involved. For example, the liquid feedback system, which was used by the Pirate Party in Germany, it worked technically, but actually people who got power, they just didn't want to accept the different decisions, and so it ended up not really being used because there was no consensus about the results. And so you see that in a lot of these like democratic experiments, like the citizen councils in Switzerland and Austria, they work perfectly, but at the end of the day, the politicians don't accept the recommendations anyway.
Right.
And so here's the alternative. Right. Here's the alternative view, I think. So I think that we're in a time of human history where we have a basic geographic organization, and that's a 3,000-year-old civilization model, with towns and cities. It's particular time space organization, and the internet disturbs that because it radically distributes intelligence, in a distributed way. So it's no longer concentrated in the institutions, in the capital city. So the kind of collective intelligence becomes, it's operating at another virtual level. And you could say, at least that's what I'm saying, that we are kind of constructing virtual nations on top of the geographical nations, right? And at some point, we'll find the right way to combine them, and that will be a new type of civilization. And we're not there yet. But in the meantime, even though your systems are not being applied in the physical world, they are already being applied by the virtual nations that are already existing. Would you agree with this idea that it's, that's really what is happening?
Definitely. And I think it's, pointing out this citizens councils and so on, they often come up with really great ideas, even in the most partisan states, coming up with really reasonable policies. But what happens is they have no teeth. They have no ability to deploy them. They have to go back to the politicians, and the politicians say, oh, we can't do that. Come on, nice suggestions, but it's just not politically feasible. Right. The great thing is when we connect these to self-executing smart contracts with funds in them, we can start to, we can bypass the power holding on to power, the political infeasibility. Right. We can just pool our funds and then do these things if they, make sense and are, this is ultimately like people power democracy. It's subsidiarity, it's localized decision-making and spending of local funds, and if we could, I feel like these technologies will be really helpful to governments in the long run, because essentially I think these are new sort of business models, quote unquote, for the commons, for public goods, for things that typically, these they don't have good revenue models, and therefore they're supported by governments or NGOs. But I think we're kind of verging on new ways to collectively fund and collectively allocate according to the needs of the people on the ground.
I think this is the priority nowadays. I've written some editorials recently. One is on the Ukraine conflict, and I'm basically arguing that it's a conflict between a market-centric Western model, that is basically run by the financial class, versus a sovereignist model, a state-centric model like in Russia and China. And so these two models are competing and now by proxy fighting with each other. And so I'm arguing that we need a third option because both of them are flawed, and that would be the common-centric model. But the problem is that we have no power, right? There's just and so the way I look at your project is as a means to in the next few years start accumulating power. And I don't know if you agree with this, but I think we need to have property, right? So for example, in Holland, there is a project called Herenboeren, which means like master farmers or lord farmers, it's more like a wordplay, but what they want to buy 64,000 acres. And so it's consumers buying land and then having an ecological contract with the farmers, right? Now that would be power. If they're not there yet, but they have like already bought a few pieces of land. And then in France, you have a community land trust called Terre des Liens. And, they're already quite substantial. They have 100 million euro in capital, and they have quite substantial holdings in Bretagne and Normandy, right? And they published a report showing that they saved the state $350 million, or euros rather, in money that they're not spending on water depollution, right? And so I'm now advocating for public ledgers, right, as one of the institutions of the commons, so that we would have public ledgers where, the farmers doing this could lodge their contribution. Like, we saved so much money in pollution by not using pesticides, and, they have ways to calculate that, and, so much biochar produced and all of that. And that could be lodged and verified on a public ledger, right? And so I see that as a mechanism to build power, because we would, be owners, right? There would be collective ownership through trusts. And so these trusts could then accumulate power and influence vis-a-vis the market and state actors, and then, build something that can, be a counterpower at first and eventually more than that. And all that you are doing, I see as a means to an end to achieve those kinds of, right? So not just operating purely in the digital, but actually starting to acquire physical assets, right? So the virtual virtual nation start acquiring physical assets, and becoming an actor. Just as in the Middle Ages, the guilds didn't originally exist, and then there was a wave of them in the after 975. And after like 70 years, they were all over the place, and they created the power of the cities, and the free cities with, run by the guilds. Anyway, so that's kind of a way of looking at what could happen with the kind of stuff that you're doing.
Absolutely. And I would say what the Common Stack is working on is kind of the under the hood pieces. Ultimately what you're speaking of is a vehicle that can get us from A to B, where a community can get in and just drive this vehicle from, the point we're at to a point of better ecological health restoration, benefits for people, rather than this sort of siphon of, the wealth transfer to the top is just basically, destroying us socially and ecologically. And I think a lot of the augmented bonding curve, conviction voting, these are all engineering heavy, they're math, they're we're still at the design phase. Ultimately, what we want to do is put the combustion engine in the vehicle and then put a hood on it. And the user doesn't have to look at those things. They just join a DAO, or, these are essentially digital guilds. A lot of them have like full on, there's Raid Guild. Right. There's a number that are directly, embracing this, like, we are digital guilds. We are, the commoners of the future. But a lot of this is still very tech heavy. This isn't technology that an indigenous community could pick up and use yet, just because, the technology is only where it is. Wallets are still, tricky. Password management, seed phrases, all of that stuff is not simple at this point. Right. But I think ultimately what we're building is a new way to value, as you said, like the ecological services. This is the great thing about open public ledgers. At the moment, a forest isn't worth anything until it's turned into lumber. We are missing out the side of the balance sheet that says this forest is providing ecological services on the value of millions, billions, or trillions of dollars a year. Our whales provide ecosystem services on the range of trillions of dollars, and yet they're being killed along our shipping routes. So we just don't have a good way at the moment to value sort of the natural accounting, the ecological services that are offered. And with these ledgers, I think we can start to at least, rebalance the playing field. Right now, every forest is at risk of being turned into lumber because there's profit in lumber. There's no profit in forest. And I think these ledgers is one way that we can start to and I'm not saying we can completely eliminate the tilt, but I think right now, the playing field is like this, and we really need to get it back somewhere closer to balance.
Do you have any arguments or explanation for the people who would say, we don't want that because that's even further commodification of nature? So I can tell you how I try to explain is what I'm saying is, no, that's not what we want. We don't want speculation, but we just want valuation, right? We just want that contributive work is valued, but we don't want to make it into a commodity that that people can speculate on. So and I think it's important that people realize the difference between those two aspects. Do you have another way to kind of you see what I mean? Because we're getting a lot of this kind of talk gets a lot of critique from certain ecological people who say, no, we don't want to marketize and commodify nature at all. This is the wrong way.
Right. And I think there's a lot of tricky nuance in there because there's a lot of money trauma. And I think, we talked about this before, actually, the difference between cold money and warm money. And I think cold money, like this extractive, I think one of the biggest problems we face is that we are in a monoculture economy. Every type of money is pretty much the same, every dominant type of money. There are thousands of alternative currencies, but none of them are interconnected and none of them scale beyond certain kind of local use case.
Right.
The dominant money in the world is all of the same type. And imagine if, in Canada, we could only grow apple trees, and the government said, you can only grow apple trees, you can only export apples. Imagine the boom and bust as pests, as, ecological crises.
You're just describing 2/3 of the world, actually. That's the way it happens, actually, in many cases. Yeah.
And it's horribly ineffective. We need resilience in ecosystems, and I think that means
monetary biodiversity,
monetary permaculture.
Yeah. Oh yeah, monetary permaculture, monetary biodiversity is what I use to. So I actually see 4 levels. You have the complementary currency level, which is explicitly local and designed to protect the local flows. It's kind of like you have a tax on when it escapes, and so that keeps more of the value local. Then the second level would be the virtual currencies, which are local in a virtual sense, they're specific to a certain domain or application or community. But they are meant more to be interchangeable in some way, right? Then I still believe the national currencies have a role to play because, if there's an economy, it needs to be managed and protected from, booms and busts. And so I don't see the abolition of that. And then this is an idea for Bernard Lietaer. On top, you would have the terra or something similar, which would be like a biophysical currency. So it would be either a single or a basket of currencies but it would be based on real things like the level of commodity production, the amount of renewable energy in the world, and so that would kind of create a fixed limit to the global economy that would reflect the realities of matter and energy that we have to operate in. And so it would be like a combination of different things that would be systemically aligned to each other.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key points as well is that these are sort of interoperable, that there are bridges between these, especially at the lower levels, because there's and I mean, we have to be careful what can flow and what can't. Reputation should never flow. My reputation should not be flowable to you, for example. And that's a lot of what at the local level, I think keeps these sort of communities ticking is the interpersonal connection. So some things like reputation need to stay with the person who earned them. And we can do that with tokens too. I think there's a lot of tokens get overly simplified in that they're all likened to Bitcoin. A lot of these, tokens could represent reputation, and they could stay with the owner and not be transferable. So there's a really huge design space of what we can do with these new Web3 technologies and different ways that we can, allow for different value diffusion, both across multiple local levels, but also up and down that chain as well. Because I think that's ultimately what we need, is the ability to translate value and reciprocity and reputation, from neighborhood to neighborhood, but also up the scale to the national and the international level. And ultimately, I think this is the framework that we need to kind of have that, the subsidiarity of decision making. Tokens are an interesting blend of votes and money, and I think they do a really good job removing these strict boundaries. And now, I mean, that's also something to be careful of. Should votes be money? But now that they can be, what interesting things can we experiment with here? And of course, what context is this deployed in? It could be a plutocratic hyper-capitalist nightmare. It also could be, with the right design context, a subsidiarity-driven, commons-based, interesting new experiment.
Right. Yeah, so you mentioned bonding curves, conviction voting. Is there anything else that is part of your stack?
A lot of ultimately it's tying in sort of the computer-aided governance as well. So the interesting thing about blockchain systems is we have, real-time data on a lot of this. So we can measure the flows, we can determine, we can tie them to outcomes, impact analysis. There's a lot of really interesting experiments around using these tools for, better social impact bonds or development impact bonds, and kind of, again, even like relocalizing who benefits from those, instead of being, international NGOs and a small local village. How can we empower these groups to support themselves, rather than relying on this exogenous philanthropic from the north to the south? We have money and expertise. How can we revalue these or recreate these systems such that the value comes from the bottom up and is also shared among those localities, rather than financiers half a world away? So I think there's a lot of really interesting ways that we can experiment with these new tools. And there's tons of experimentation going on. IXO Foundation, Regen Network, the number of DAOs and, regenerative eco-villages, as you've mentioned, NFT experiments to fund.
It's very hard to follow everything.
It's impossible, but that's part of the excitement.
So when did you start, and where are you now? And then maybe what are your expectations? So if you can tell us how far have you gotten compared to your ideal and where you want it to be?
Yeah, sounds great. And then I think we can probably wrap after that, because I've got to run, unfortunately. But so where we're at so far, so the Commons Stack has been running since 2018, I guess. We've been experimenting on a lot of these tools. Most of them are built on the Ethereum ecosystem, actually on XDAI. So it's a side chain to avoid a lot of the gas fees. We've worked very closely with a group of developers called One Hive.
Already too technical for some of our audience, but we'll just let it pass.
So the first deployment of a commons has been launched. It's called the Token Engineering Commons. So we're using essentially the tools we're building to bootstrap funding for more tools, essentially. So our first experiment is sort of our dog fooding our own technology, and launching the Token Engineering Commons. And the goal is to build more token engineering tools in the Common Stack toolkit. What is coming up, I would love to end on this. The Common Stack is launching the Commons Prize. So they're currently looking across the ecosystem at all the communities that want to launch a Commons, because these tools are still quite tech heavy. They're not easy to deploy. They're not easy to use. They need a bit of sort of hand holding and developer assistance to deploy. So the Common Stack is currently looking for a community who is looking to deploy a cyber physical commons with the augmented bonding curve, conviction voting, etc. Right. And that's open right now. If you go on the Common Stack Twitter, there's a sign up form, and yeah, they're looking for, you know, artist collectives or you know, Web3 familiar communities, but they want to start essentially deploying more commons and getting more experiments out there, so we can continue to iterate these tools and ultimately make them useful to communities of purpose on the ground.
Okay, I just want to say maybe that, you know, what I would wish to see is at some point that people like you, an organization like yours, an initiative like yours, start actually really, you know, start relating with physical production, right? I would like to see like a farming community or community land trust being empowered, you know, to do what they do even better because of the tools, the type of tools that you're making. Is that in the cards or not, or maybe in the future, or what do you think?
Definitely. I would say a few years before these tools are easily deployable, you know, by a non-technical community, maybe like 3 to 5 years. I feel like there's still so many rabbit holes, and Web3 tech just isn't quite there yet for the end user. It's if you're driven and tech interested, it's possible, but I see these technologies being useful for on the ground communities within the next few years for sure. And of course, we want to make sure all the kinks are worked out before we put, you know, real world assets, livelihoods, etc. on the line. But I think those days are coming. Absolutely.
Okay, so I want to just say one thing before we end, and then we probably invite Emmanuel in to say like the goodbye word. I just want to. So you know that I'm working around this idea of cosmo-local production. So relocalizing production, you know, through distributed manufacturing, but connected to these global open design communities. And it may sound like a gimmick, but you know, there's a lot of talk now about anywheres versus nowheres, because you know there is like a political shift where people are really voting on their cultural values. And you know, the old working class is becoming conservative and, you know, wants more protectionism and nation state revival. And then the cognitive people are voting for left parties, but they're kind of losing ground. And so the way that people talk about it is saying, you know, there's the anywheres that are virtual and can travel around and so can deal better with pandemics. And then the people are really like, you know, kind of imprisoned in their physical environment, and you know, they're being deindustrialized, that they can't move. And so I wanted to introduce a new term which I call the everywheres, right? And the everywheres would be those anywheres that are actually at the service of the local, right? So kind of like in the Middle Ages, the guilds, the role of the guilds, like the cathedral builders, they were traveling, right? They were building one cathedral in one place, now they're going to another. And so I think we need those kinds of people that create the bridge between the local and the digital communities, and are kind of at the service, you know, of this relocalization and converging and marrying those two levels of scale. And you know, I see Common Stack as a potential player in this kind of philosophy. Like Emmanuel, I think unless you want to say something, I can call Emmanuel to say goodbye, I guess.
Yes.
So we're done, and I hope it wasn't too complex. You know, there's a lot of technical terms flying around, but yeah.
No, I think it's okay, and thanks a lot, both of you. And I just want to say just a little thing because about the concrete of the project, and we talked before with Jeff in backstage about the possibility to experiment Common Stack on an artistic project, and we think it will be interesting because it's not an economic model, and so it will be interesting, and I really want to test this. I think it will be a very great experience.
Great.
And,
yeah.
it's amazing to make this presentation, and we are very, very happy. And again, thanks a lot, and we hope to see you soon, and to know the development of a project.
Yeah, thank you, Emmanuel, for inviting us, and thank you, Jeff, for your very brilliant exposition of your project. Yes. Yeah, very happy also.
Well, thanks for your insights, and I appreciate some of those. I'm gonna follow up on that anywheres and everywheres. I like that framing as well. Thanks so much. Great talking to you guys.
Yeah. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.